6 pounds, 11 minutes. One piece of packing foam that should have gone in the trash. Welcome back to Forbidden Lures. Today we're exposing a rig that the tackle industry buried on purpose. Not because it stopped working, but because it worked too well and cost too little. We're talking about polystyrene foam. The same stuff protecting your new TV inside the box. Thread a thumbnail-sized piece above your hook, and you've got a weapon that outfishes $30 lures 5-to-1. Every technique in this video costs you a grand total of 11 cents. And by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly why no major tackle brand will ever put this on a shelf. 1. The Great Tackle Industry Cover-Up. Back in the 60s and 70s, the foam rig wasn't underground. It was standard equipment. Bank anglers across the Southeast, commercial fishermen on the Cumberland River, guide services along the Kentucky lakes, they all ran foam because it flat-out caught fish when nothing else would. Bass clubs taught it to rookies on day one. Magazine writers covered it openly. Nobody questioned it because nobody needed to. It just worked. Then tournament bass fishing hit national television and the money showed up. And here's the thing about money. It doesn't reward what works. It rewards what sells. A piece of styrofoam that lasts an entire season and costs nothing? You can't build a product line around that. You can't run a Super Bowl ad for it. You can't get a pro angler to hold it up and smile for the camera. So the industry quietly walked away. Not because something better came along, because nothing better was going to make them rich. Let's do the math. A decent bag of premium soft plastics runs you $8 to $10. Lasts maybe 3-4 trips before they're shredded or lost. Over a 22-day season, that's roughly $220 in plastics alone. A foam rig? 11 cents. One setup. The whole season. They spent decades convincing you that expensive equals effective. Your bank account knows that was never true. But here's where it gets interesting. The reason foam works isn't just about buoyancy. It's about exploiting a sensory system that most anglers don't even know exists. 2. The science of the strike zone and the lateral line. Close your eyes in a dark room. Someone walks past you 3 feet away. You can't see them, you can't hear their footsteps on the carpet, but you feel the air shift. You feel the pressure change against your skin. That split-second awareness? Fish have that dialed up to 11. It's called the lateral line. The lateral line is a row of sensory organs running down each side of a fish's body. It picks up pressure waves, micro vibrations, displacement changes in the water, things no human eye could ever detect. And here's what the tackle aisle doesn't want you thinking about. The lures they sell you are designed to look good on a peg hook under fluorescent lighting. They're engineered to catch fishermen, not fish. A foam rig generates a low-frequency, erratic vibration pattern, not the aggressive mechanical throb of a crankbait. To a predatory fish, that irregular pulse reads exactly like a dying shad. Wounded, vulnerable, worth chasing. They can lock onto that signal from over 20 feet away in murky water. Now here's a myth that needs to die. Everyone says blue catfish are bottom feeders, noses in the mud, rooting around like pigs. That's wrong. They spend most of their feeding time cruising 1 to 5 feet off the bottom, scanning with smell and vibration for food drifting in the current. Bait that's buried in the substrate? Invisible to them. But suspend that same bait with a piece of foam, and suddenly it's hanging right in their detection window, exactly where their lateral line is already searching. And bass? Roughly 2/3 of their active feeding happens while they're suspended off the bottom. Your standard soft plastic on a jig head has a fatal flaw. The second you stop reeling, it drops like a rock, falls straight through the strike zone, and sits on the mud doing nothing. Foam fixes that. It creates a natural suspension point. Your bait holds in the kill zone 4 to 6 times longer than a conventional jig. Anglers running foam-assisted rigs consistently land around 3.5 fish per hour versus less than 1 per hour on a standard weighted jig. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a completely different day on the water. So you've got the science. Now let's build the rig. And it's going to take you less time than tying your shoes. 3. The fingernail hack. Building your 10-cent miracle. Here's everything you need. A piece of extruded polystyrene foam. Grab it from an appliance box, a shipping crate, or a dollar store pool noodle. One single pool noodle gives you enough material for roughly 1,400 rigs. Read that again. 1,400. Cut a piece the size of your thumbnail. Not bigger, not smaller. Thumbnail. That specific volume gives you the perfect buoyancy to weight ratio. And this is where most people blow it. They cut the foam too big, thinking more float means more fish. It doesn't. An oversized chunk looks unnatural in the water, and fish will mouth it once and spit it out. Thread your line straight through the center of the foam piece before you tie your hook. Then tie on whatever hook you trust. Now pay attention, because this one detail separates a rig that catches fish from a rig that catches nothing. That foam must sit freely on the line, 3 to 4 inches above your bait. Do not pinch it tight against the hook. It needs to slide. When a fish hits, that free sliding motion creates a pulse, a tiny rhythmic bob that mimics a bait fish struggling near the surface. Every twitch of your rod tip amplifies it. Fish that completely ignore a static presentation will crush a pulsing one 3 out of 4 times. 4 minutes to tie, 11 cents in materials. And what you've just built will outperform gear that costs 300 times more. But we're not done. Because when you combine this with soft plastics, things go from effective to absolutely ruthless. 4. Modifying soft plastics and the Carolina synergy. If you throw hollow body tubes, and you should because they've been quietly destroying bass, crappie, and lake trout for decades, here's a modification that turns them into something borderline unfair. Grab a cheap foam earplug, the soft polyurethane kind you can buy in bulk for pennies. Compress it and slide it up inside the hollow body cavity of the tube. It slips in without tearing the plastic, then expands to fill the space and provide uniform internal buoyancy. You want just enough foam so the tube has a slow, horizontal rise when you let it sit. Now, put that on a Carolina rig. The heavy weight pulls your line to the bottom, but the foam inside the tube forces the bait to suspend off the substrate. As you drag it back, the tube darts side to side with this wild, erratic action that triggers schooling bass into a competitive feeding frenzy. It's also devastating on bedding bass during the spawn. Switch to a light bullet weight, and the foam slows down the tube's sinking glide to this exaggerated, slow-motion fall right in their face. Bedding bass cannot ignore that. They'll hit it out of pure territorial rage. Now, here's where it gets weird, and this is a trick I've never seen anyone talk about on camera. You fish hollow body frogs over lily pads? Take your frog, cut a small hole in the back, drop in a few BBS or small shot, then stuff in a piece of styrofoam. Seal it up with a hot glue gun. The foam keeps the frog floating, but the BBS weigh it down just enough that the body sits deeper in the surface film. When a bass explodes on it, the heavier frog drops right into its mouth instead of getting pushed away by the water displacement. Your hookup ratio goes through the roof. And those BBS rattling around inside? That's an acoustic beacon pulling bass in from 10 feet away through the thickest cover. All of that from packing foam and a pair of scissors. But catching fish means nothing if you can't land them. And the next section is where 90% of anglers lose their biggest fish of the day. 5. Mastering the strike and the patience game. You've made the cast. The rig settles. The foam lifts your bait to that perfect suspension point, and now everything in your body wants to do something. Crank, twitch, move. Don't. Give it a slow 2 count after it lands. Let the foam do its work. Then 1 slow rod tip lift, about a foot of movement, and let it fall again. And then you feel it. Not a slam, not a heavy pull, a tap. Just a single, clean tap. Your adrenaline screams at you to swing. Don't do that either. If you set the hook on the tap, you pull the bait right out of the fish's mouth, 6 times out of 10. Here's what's actually happening. The fish bumped it. It's interested. It's turning. When you feel the tap, count. 1, 2. You'll feel the line go slightly slack for a half second. That slack is the fish rotating its body to swallow the bait head first. That is your moment. Bring the rod up firm and steady. Load the blank, let the drag sing, and you're on. Tap, 2 count, slack, set. Burn that sequence into your muscle memory. Now, if you're running the foam as a strike indicator and the float suddenly plunges straight down, set the hook with a sharp vertical pull. If the float takes off laterally to one side, strike in the opposite direction to bury that hook right in the corner of their jaw. You've got the rig. You've got the technique. But what if I told you there's a way to supercharge this whole system using things sitting in your kitchen right now? 6. Supercharging the hack with kitchen science. Remember the foam earplug inside the tube? Here's an upgrade the industry cannot replicate with any product on their shelves. Break off a tiny piece of Alka-Seltzer and push it up inside the tube body right next to the foam. When that tablet hits the water, it starts fizzing, releasing a slow trail of CO2 microbubbles. The foam keeps the tube perfectly suspended in the strike zone while those bubbles rise off the bait, creating visible attraction and a faint popping sound that mimics aquatic insects breaking the surface. You've just built a multi-sensory presentation: vibration, suspension, visual, and acoustic for less than the cost of a candy bar. Now, a couple of rigging secrets that keep this system performing strike after strike. If you throw Texas rigs and your bullet weight keeps sliding away from the bait, stuff a wooden toothpick into the rear hole of the weight and snap off the excess. Locks it right in place. And to stop short-striking fish from pulling your soft plastic down the hook shank and killing the presentation, run the plastic up over the hook eye, push a toothpick straight through the plastic and through the eye, and trim both sides. Your bait is now pinned, maintaining its profile through hit after hit without any re-rigging. One more. If you buy soft plastics in bulk and they start drying out and fusing together in the bag, drop half a teaspoon of vegetable cooking oil in there and work it through. Completely neutral. Won't degrade the plastic, fish don't notice it. You'll stop tearing off appendages every time you pull a creature bait out of the package. Small tricks, massive results. And speaking of massive, we haven't talked about reading the water yet, because nature has been running its own foam system since long before any of us picked up a rod. 7. The foam line, nature's conveyor belt. Next time you're on the water, look for the foam. Not your foam, nature's foam. Those long, drifting lines of white froth swirling through eddies, collecting below rapids and waterfalls. Most anglers cast right past them. That's a mistake you'll never make again after today. Foam lines form when organic material in the water creates natural surfactants that reduce surface tension. And to a fish, a foam line is a dinner table with a roof over it. Here's why. That layer of foam breaks up the water's surface just enough to hide fish from overhead predators, eagles, ospreys, herons. Underneath that canopy, they feel safe, and the water below rapids and falls, saturated with dissolved oxygen. Fish will stack up in those zones, nose into the current, waiting for food to drift right to them. There's an old saying among river guides, "Foam is home." And they're not being poetic, they're being literal. This is where your foam rig reaches its full potential. Fishing spawn sacks for steelhead or trout? Add a brightly colored styrofoam drift ball to your size 6 or 8 octopus hook. That lifts the bait off the bottom. Cast into the current, keep your rod tip high to minimize line drag, a technique called high sticking, and let your foam-enhanced bait drift at the exact same speed as the natural foam line above it. To the fish holding in the cold, oxygenated water below, your offering is indistinguishable from the real thing. They feel secure under the canopy. They detect a perfectly suspended meal, and they commit with zero hesitation. Now, before we wrap up, there's one more species that deserves its own conversation, and it's the one that will test your patience more than any bass ever could. Eight, the ultimate carp indicator and the baited parcel carp are paranoid. There's no other word for it. They feel the resistance of a traditional round bobber, and they drop the bait instantly. No second chances. So throw the bobber away. Here's what the old European carp specialists figured out. Cut a small slit in a piece of styrofoam and clip it directly to your line between your reel and the first rod guide. Leave your bail open. When a carp picks up the bait and starts to move, the line pulls freely. Zero resistance. The foam slides along until it hits the first guide and pops off. That pop is your strike indicator. Tie a short piece of line from the foam to your rod holder so it doesn't end up in the water. Clean, simple, no resistance detection that carp never feel coming. And if you use baited parcels, wrapping your hook and chum together in a mesh or tissue, drop the parcel in, give your rod a sharp jerk to rip it open, and the foam float on your main line instantly suspends your hook right in the center of that chum cloud. The fish swarm the cloud. Your hook is sitting in the middle of it, completely invisible. It's the cleanest trap in freshwater fishing. Here's the truth the tackle industry spends millions trying to bury. A fish's brain runs on 3 triggers: a specific vibration, a certain silhouette, and a bait sitting at exactly the right depth. A thumbnail of packing foam nails all 3. Anglers running foam rigs pull a 74% strike-to-land ratio compared to 31% on a standard drop shot. That's not an edge, that's domination. Cold water, muddy water, post-spawn shutdowns, high-pressure bluebird skies when every forum tells you to stay home. The foam rig doesn't care. It produces when nothing else will. So skip the premium aisle. Hit the dollar store. Dig through the shipping box in your garage. Cut your thumbnail-sized piece, thread it above your hook, master the 2-count tap, and go empty your local lake. If this changed the way you think about your tackle box, you already know what to do. Drop a comment and tell me, river or lake? Where are you taking this 11-cent miracle first? I read every single one. Stop renting your results from tackle shops. Start owning the water. I'll see you out there.